Hi, everyone. Welcome to another VSG Oceanside chat. We have been doing these for so long now virtually since the pandemic, and we have such a great library. I'm going to take a moment at some point to drop that library in the chat so you can see every amazing topic that we had thus far. Today is a very special Oceanside chat because this is a topic that comes up often, and we have limited resources in how we support teams in this way. And so I can't tell you how thrilled I am to have Juan joining us. A little bit about Juan. He's a seasoned business and tech leader with over 15 years experience leading cross-functional teams. He manages business operations and he drives continuous improvement in innovative sectors. His expertise is in securing government funding, especially in areas of research for displays, electro-optical sensors, AI/ML, and wearable electronics. Currently, he serves as the co-founder and COO of Pasadena Digital, which is one of our teams at the garage. They're an aerospace team, and he's also a strategic advisor for other startups who are focusing on growth and innovation. Today, he'll be talking about, is SBIR right for your startup? And so, this is, again, such a huge question. And it's also a completely different funding path. And so I just can't wait to hear what Juan has to say about this topic. So take it away, Juan, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Arcelia, and thank you for hosting, and thank you and Dave Eastman for welcoming me to the Viterbi Startup Garage. It's been great participating here with the other entrepreneurs and startup founders over the last few months, and some of the experiences I've shared there have really colored how I frame this talk and try and make it accessible to a broader audience. And as you said, I have a lot of experience working with small businesses, but really not so much startups. And so when I entered at Physical Optics and later at Intellisense, while they were small businesses, they weren't startups. And so I'll get to share some of my experiences from that and try and put it into the perspective too for the broader community. So with that, jumping in, really today, I want to answer the headline question by kind of peeling back a few layers and answering some other questions that will give you more perspective to really answer that question. The first is really the what. What is SBIR? I'll give a quick intro to that. Then I'll talk about the how, essentially. How do I write a winning proposal? And I'm just going to scrape the surface on that. It's a very, very broad topic. And that'll frame the discussion to better understand whether to pursue SBIR for each of you for your businesses. And if anybody online is kind of like me today in the world where everything is very distracting and our attention spans only last 15 seconds, I'm actually going to answer the headline question right now on the first slide. So is this the right funding path for your startup? The answer is yes, provided that it can support achieving the strategic goals of your business, taking into account the opportunity cost. So sounds pretty straightforward, but I think to really appreciate the answer to that question and to have enough perspective to apply it and put it into practice for your business, it's going to be important to stick around for the rest of the hour. So let's dive in and we'll go from there. So starting with the first question, what is the SBIR program? So the SBIR program is a legally established program where any federal government agency with an extramural that's outside R&D budget over $100 million must set aside about 3.2% of that budget for small businesses. And the way that that process is administered is through the SBIR program. And so what that amounts to is about $4 billion of total SBIR funding that's available annually. And I'll talk a bit more about how that's distributed on the other slides. But this is essentially a huge opportunity, a huge amount of funding that's available. And really, the first part of the talk is how do you tap into that? So the SBIR program was established with several goals in mind. Really, the first and foremost is driving technological innovation from small businesses into commercialization, into industry. And so being able to really realize those innovations in a way that that contributes to the benefit of society as a whole. And so that kind of links the first and second bullets there, where in addition to doing the R&D, there's also a commercialization aspect to every SBIR contract. And that is where the small business involved in the research works to bring that to market. And then the other aspect of the SBIR program is that it's to support businesses that are from socially or economically disadvantaged segments. So if that's an aspect of your business as a founder, then that gives you some additional kind of points, let's say, in your SBIR application that can help you get funded. So any questions at this early stage? Okay, we'll move ahead. So the format is different for every agency that participates in SBIR, and I'll just give a little bit of flavor of that, but it's an extremely broad program, and it's done in many different ways. There's lots of regulations. But one of the first things in terms of understanding the program and how it works to get started is that each agency puts out a statement of its needs, and these are released periodically. So some agencies release it once a year, some agencies release 2-3 times a year. And these are generally referred to as solicitations. And these solicitations go out with the problem statements that that agency is looking for. And these topics are only open to small business concerns, eligible SBCs. We'll talk about what the eligibility requirements are on the next chart. And so that kind of frames the program. It's a set aside for small businesses to compete. There's lots of other federal government funding, but that other funding can be competed by universities, large businesses, national labs. And so that can sometimes be a very difficult area to get into for small businesses. So SBIR is a great way to start to tap into federal programs and to start to do work with the US government in a way that's set aside and a little bit easier to get started than a lot of other federal funding opportunities. So this funding is administered in the format of grants or contracts from the US federal government. And the great thing about the way this funding comes as a result of that is that it is non-dilutive. So there's no equity impact and there's no debt. So you get the funding and the grant or contract, and while there's some work that you need to do to fulfill the requirements, generally speaking, those are pretty low. And it doesn't typically demand a lot of additional administrative work. However, there's, of course, a caveat for every rule with SBIR. There's a caveat, and the caveat here is that you can get to more rigorous contracts later on with important requirements and deliverables that you need to stay on top of. And I'm not going to talk too much about it today, but I think it's important to touch on another federal government program that's kind of the sister program of SBIR. It's called STTR, Small Business Technology Transfer. And what the STTR program is very largely similar to SBIR, but with two key differences. So in addition, so a small business is always the lead, whether it's SBIR or STTR. However, a fundamental requirement of your application for an STTR proposal is that the small business partners with a research institution, RI. So this could be a university like USC. It could be a national lab like National Renewable Energy Lab or Lawrence Livermore, something like that. Or it could be a federally funded research and development center, FFRDC, like the Aerospace Corporation, for example. So that partnership needs to exist, and there's some cost share requirements associated with that. And there's also, the second point is there's a technology transfer. So some sort of IP agreement needs to exist between the research institution and the small business concern, since STTR is about bringing innovations from those research institutes to market, and the small business then becomes the conduit for that. So there's a lot more information available on the SBIR.gov website that explains these details in more detail.
There's a question in the chat. What's the definition of a small business, Juan?
Great question. That's actually a good segue to the next slide. So a small business is defined on the left-hand side. And so these are the eligibility requirements from the SBIR website. And this is a summary of what's actually a 20-page document. So, if any of these criteria you're kind of on the edge of or you want to understand better, highly recommend you take a look at it. But to start with, the first and foremost thing is that a small business is defined by its employee count, not by the total revenue. And that employee count is 500 people or fewer. And so it should be, that does include any affiliates. So if you have a spinoff or if you have a other subsidiary, that is going to count towards your head count and could work against you, but the size is 500 employees. So the other key requirements are that it's a US business, so located in the US and majority owned by US citizens. So whether that's you as an individual or your investors. So if you are an international, foreign national, basically, or you have international investors that have a bulk of the business, you're going to have to take a really close look at this. It may disqualify you from the SBIR program. It's also required that you're a for-profit business. All the work needs to be done in the US, and that's a requirement regardless of the agency. It's not just a Department of Defense thing. And then another important requirement is around the principal investigator. The principal investigator is the lead of the technical effort, right? So you're trying to realize an innovation, and the principal investigator is the one really who's responsible for technically executing the project and making sure that all of the terms are met in terms of the work effort. And that PI is a key person. They get represented in the contract that you ultimately get or the grant, and they need to be an employee of the small business concern. So 51% employee. So if you want a team with a university professor or something like that, they're probably going to be a consultant, right? If they're not actually a member of the business, and your PI is going to need to be a full-time employee. And the interpretations and some gray areas with these, do take a look at the regulations. I'll pause there. I see there's a hand raised. Any questions?
Hi, yes, my name is Christina Stone. Thank you for hosting this chat today. For all of us, I'm one of the co-founders of Airgrapher, where we are harvesting water from the air. And I'm looking to apply for an SBIR grant it's due by March. And so really interested in getting like all the requirements down. So thank you once again. With specifically the PI investigator, does that need, can I be the PI investigator, or do I have to have somebody that is staff at the university?
Yeah, so if you're doing SBIR, then it should be a member of your company. So you would be a candidate for that. I'm assuming, it's your business, you work at your business. So yeah, you'd be a candidate for that. The other consideration that you're going to want to make, and it's going to differ from agency to agency, and I'll talk a little bit about this later, is the qualifications of the PI. So one of the key evaluation criteria is the team's capability. And first and foremost are the qualifications of the PI. So so whatever your background might be, in terms of your education, your relevant work experience, if you have publications, particularly in the areas of scientific research, each of those is going to become important to be able to demonstrate that those are relevant to the proposed scope of work.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question, Juan, before you move on.
Yes.
So in the world of startups, there's just so much gray area always. And in your key considerations, the differentiator between incremental product improvements and R&D and prototyping is probably not super discrete in terms of like what constitutes what. So in knowing that, is it just about how you talk about it in your application so that it doesn't sound like you're doing incremental improvements to your product, and you're more kind of thinking about like the long project outcomes and talking about funding in terms of these long project outcomes? Like, can you help me understand the difference between?
Yeah. No, that's a really great question, and there is a lot of nuance to it. So, absolutely, how you present it in the proposal is critical. And And so that could take something that, you know, looks incremental, maybe from one reviewer's vantage point, but really presents it in a way where it's maybe not earth-shattering, but let's say is worthwhile of a technological advancement, that the impact it's going to make by realizing that in terms of maybe a more developed prototype or an engineered prototype is significant enough to warrant funding. But with that being said, I would say at a minimum, proceed with caution. It's definitely going to be important which agency you're responding to. So an agency that's more on the scientific side, like NSF, for example, or in often cases DOE, is going to be looking for something that is much more innovative, much more risky. And I think that that's where the biggest distinction can be made, is that kind of like the bullet above, using SBIR to fund R&D and prototyping, the idea is that there's a certain level of risk. There's always a certain level of risk with R&D. R&D might fail, and that's a good thing. You need to be taking those kinds of risks if you're doing good research, and that's why the program exists, is to fund risky endeavors. If you end up doing something where you're playing it too safe, that's where you can start to get to incremental improvement, and you start to get outside of really what the program was intended for. So I think there's an opportunity to leverage SBIR to do things that are maybe more engineering-like than scientific breakthrough, but your reviewers may or may not see it that way. Looks like there's another question here.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up question. So I know there's 3 different phases of SBIR. Is it possible to say like the breakthrough innovation or the really risky go or no go step will happen during phase 2, and that phase 1 is more of like we just need money to get like some production capabilities up? Or is it imperative that in each phase of the SBIR that you have some sort of breakthrough innovation or risky challenge?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll talk a little bit more about the phases on an upcoming slide, but to answer your question, I think the innovative piece really starts at phase 1. That's the heart of where you're doing the first studies of that innovative capability. So that is to say that the funding from SBIR, while it's great for a first-time entrepreneur, or you can even use it to launch your business, it's not really the funding that's meant to launch the startup costs of your business. It's meant to pursue the R&D around that technological innovation. So to use the money to do kind of business startup costs, or start to build out production capabilities for like an existing product line that you intend to innovate in the future, that wouldn't be what the funding is meant for. You'd be in an unlikely position to win the phase 1. Now, when you flip it around though, and you spend that time in the phase 1 doing your trade studies, modeling and simulation, initial design work, initial kind of prototype, think of like, you know, initial kind of mock-up of software or like a 3D printed hardware, things like that, that you can kind of test the initial technical principles with, get some initial product market fit feedback. That then lays the groundwork for, hey, you know what? This technology actually it's working pretty well. And we can now envision how that could be embodied into a product or into some intellectual property that we can leverage in the future. Then the phase 2, you can start to do more advanced implementation and integration of that, and kind of build from there. But I would say that the innovation really needs to be the heart of a phase 1 is the proof of concept feasibility demonstration of the core technology, the core innovation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, let's move ahead, and I'm sure there's some other questions, but hopefully I'll get to them in the upcoming slides. So this chart shows how the funding total of SBIR is distributed across the agencies, and the names of the 11 agencies that participate are shown on the right, along with their acronyms, which I'll probably use liberally through the conversation. And really the major takeaway of the $4 billion total, the vast majority of the funding is with the first 5 agencies there listed on the left: the Department of Defense, DoD, Health and Human Services, HHS primarily through the National Institutes of Health, NIH, Department of Energy, DOE, National Science Foundation, NSF, and NASA. So that's over 98% of the funding is with those 5. So what does that mean? It means that if you're looking to propose something to SBIR, and let's say you have a technology that's useful to the EPA, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to approach the EPA, but just realize that they fund a handful, I mean, literally a handful of phase 1s and phase 2s per year, versus if that same idea can help support some of the broader applications of the top 5 agencies, DoD, NIH, they do hundreds of SBIR awards per quarter. So the scale of funding resources available and the scale of the programs is vastly different, and it's something worth considering when you consider who to apply to. Okay, and this slide shows the different formats, and there's a lot of information here. I'll just kind of explain generally how to read it, and I understand the slides will be sent out afterwards, so you can take a look and kind of study it, in more detail at that time. The agencies are listed across the top, and then each of the rows going across covers first the max phase 1 award size. So these are largely similar across all the different agencies. It's somewhere in the range of few $100,000, and that in and of itself really shouldn't affect who you would approach with your SBIR application. The award type, I talked about contracts versus grants. Contracts tend to be a little bit more stringent than grants in terms of deliverables and reports and kind of overall administrative requirements. In terms of topic types, so those solicitations that come out, they can vary quite widely from topics that are very, very specific, like the Department of Defense tends to be very, very specific, and they'll release topics for new techniques to remove barnacles from submarines, or looking for new algorithms to put onto a satellite to better track cars on the ground. Things like that, where it's almost like in and of itself, just the problem statement is so niche that it's probably somewhat unlikely that your business is doing that today. The other sorry. The other extent of that is broad topics. So other agencies like NSF is a great agency to write SBIR to. They have almost any area where scientific R&D is ongoing is applicable. And in the biggest difference then when you write those proposals to an agency with a broad or specific solicitation is the specific ones need to be highly tailored to that very specific problem that's being addressed. And the broad topics need to emphasize more what that agency's mission is. And so for example, something like Department of Energy, right? DOE, although they have somewhat specific topics, all responsive proposals need to emphasize how you're supporting making energy safer, cleaner, cheaper, right? Those are major mission objectives for DOE as a department within the US federal government. And so if you have a new solution that addresses that, regardless of the technology or implementation, then that's going to put you in a relatively better position when you write your DOE proposal. The review type means, are they reviewed by internal staff within that organization, or do they use an external review panel? An external review panel for those from the university community is kind of like when you submit a paper to a journal and it goes out to an outside panel. A lot of university grants get reviewed that way too. It's just a little different interaction in terms of how those reviews are done. And then the last line might be a little bit controversial in terms of my kind of binary classification here, yes and no, but there's an important message here, which is that, does the agency buy products for use by individuals who work for that agency, right? So DoD is like a prime example of that. The Army buys stuff ultimately to equip its soldiers, right? As an example. And so if you do work under an SBIR for an agency that buys products, then some aspect of the work can be done with those end users in mind. And you have the opportunity then to tap into not just working with that agency for the funding in the near term, but they could be your ultimate customer of the product resulting from your innovation. And that's a great place to be in. And it changes the relationship, the working relationship, and it may strengthen the relevance of using SBIR to get to that market ultimately to your business. Any questions here?
I'd like to just quickly mention that originally our only VSG resource for SBIR was someone, his name is Earl Hager. He still helps us out, and he sits on a panel for review. And so he is such a great resource for the garage, because he kind of has those insights as to how these applications get, you know, sliced and diced, and where like the quick cuts happen. And so and if anyone is interested in connecting with him, please let me know. And then there's a question, Christina.
Hi, yes, thank you. With respect to like a patent, I talked to somebody that went through the SBIR process, and they told me that I guess I'm confirming this information with you. They told me that if you don't have your patent prior to applying for the SBIR grant, specifically with the DoD, that if they help you get the patent because like the money's used for prototyping, then they own part of the patent. Is that true?
I'm going to communicate my understanding in this area. It's a little bit outside of my background, but it is true that once you have federal funding to develop an idea or reduce it to practice, you then are subject to the requirements of the Bayh-Dole Act, which then requires you to file an invention report. And if I understand that correctly, what that means is you still own your IP, but the government has some rights in it, particularly if you kind of have like, as the small business or the industry element, you have sort of the right of first refusal of the patent. But if you don't pursue it, then I believe the US government can. So it does fall under that Bayh-Dole Act. And invention reporting is required for all of the agencies.
Thank you.
Okay. So I think this is the last slide on the SBIR program background. We talked about it occurring in phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Really, the SBIR funding piece of it only applies to phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 3 is outside of SBIR funding. So I'll come back to that in a moment. As we talked about, phase 1 is really to do the proof of concept demonstration of the technology, really prove out that initial innovation and explore the commercial potential. And then we talked about the funding levels. In terms of the time frame, it's usually about a 6 to 9 month effort. It's open to all small businesses to apply, so it's competitive. And there's a lot of different information on the web about win rates. This is my personal opinion based on experience. I think there's multiple sources of conflicting information online. Depending on the agency, I think you can expect to win about 10 to 30% of the proposals you submit under phase 1 for many reasons. So if you look at this and you are at 30%, great job. If you're at 60%, congratulations. But if you've submitted 1 or 2 and you're disappointed why you didn't win, then submit some more. You may not have just really, tuned up your proposal enough. For phase 2, this is primarily open to individuals who completed a phase 1. There's a few exceptions to that, but we'll gloss over that for now. And you continue the R&D that you initiated in phase 1, and that allows you to develop a prototype, kind of further establish commercial applications. And this is where there's a much larger sum of money. So we're talking about $750,000 to $1.5 million, in some cases up to $2 million. And that's for an 18 to 24 month period of performance. And typically the win rate here is much higher, 35 to 50%. Definitely being at the 50% plus mark is going to be important if you are a business that does a large number of SBIRs. Otherwise, you can be disqualified from the program. Phase 3 is really any commercialization or market revenue that you get after phase 1 and phase 2. So at that point, if you've taken that technology to market, then that is considered a phase 3. Now, in some cases, such as Department of Defense, there is also an opportunity to get a phase 3 contract from the US government where they can continue the work that you did under the phase 1 and phase 2, whether that's additional R&D, which happens rarely, or to get to procurement, which also happens rarely, but somewhat more frequently than more R&D. And so there's no dollar or time limits. It's its own contract. But the great thing about a phase 3, and this is another advantage of the SBIR program, is that the government, the federal government, which typically has to procure competitively all new products or anything that they buy, can actually justify that the competition already took place under the phase 1 and phase 2 and proceed with a non-competitive procurement, sometimes referred to as a sole source award. And so that's a great opportunity that if you've been through a phase 1 or phase 2 and there's a US government customer that really wants to continue to use their funds, not SBIR funds, to invest in you, to procure things, then they can leverage that contract vehicle, which can expedite contract award.
I have a couple.
Any other? Yeah, please.
So my first question is, as you are applying to many SBIR application openings, are there any like non-compete style SBIRs that expect you to just accept one grant and stick with that, or anything? Are, you know, in terms of limitations, like, is there anything to be aware of, to keep an eye out for?
Yeah, so generally speaking, you always have the freedom to submit multiple proposals, but anytime you're pursuing funding from the government, or I think ethically from anyone, you need to make sure that it's for different work. So ultimately, if you get funded for two very similar proposals that you submitted are identical scope of work from, let's say you submit one proposal to DOE and then a month later you submit one to NSF, and it's more or less the same innovation, same scope of work, but different agency, you cannot accept both awards without somehow differentiating the scope of work. That would be considered, generally speaking, double dipping or getting paid for the same work twice. So that's a constraint. It is easy to avoid that being an issue, but it's something to keep in mind, is that there's parts of the application that when you submit that ask you questions about, have you submitted essentially the same work to any other government agency, and you should declare it at that point.
And then the other question is just in terms of how the phases work. Let's say you are awarded a phase 1, how much auditing and work happens after that award between then and your phase 2 application? Like, obviously there's a big bulk of bandwidth and time and dedication you have to put just to getting these applications in, which in and of itself is like a big question startups should be asking themselves if they have that. And then the next question is, okay, great, you got it awarded. What's the expectation to continuously provide these types of reports and updates so that you can be a better candidate for phase 2, and what, you know, and the commitment of that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I had a slide in the backup that kind of talks to this. I'll give a quick summary of it, and if we have time, I can come back to it at the end. But generally speaking, it varies widely between agencies. But the theme is that, yes, the major focus of your phase 1 execution, while the initial funding is great and you need to focus on the technical feasibility demonstration, maybe that's the PI that's focused on that, but as the business entity, maybe there's a kind of CEO, maybe who's a different individual on the business side from the PI, that individual needs to be focused on winning phase 2. And really the major point from the business of winning the phase 1 or executing the phase 1 is positioning themselves to win the phase 2. So what does that mean? It does mean that to the extent that it's required, you know, quality professional reports, regular communications with the sponsor, whether that's a technical point of contact or a PM on the government side, really making sure you understand the due dates and when different documents and submittals are required. That's going to be pretty important. You know, how much time does it take? It varies widely from agency to agency. You know, could be as low as 10% of the total time you work on the program, could be as much as 50% of the time you work on the program in terms of paying attention to the programmatics outside of the technical work.
Great, thank you.
Good questions. Okay, let's move ahead because I really want to make sure we have enough time to get to the kind of heart of this talk, which is the last section. But I think this will be a popular topic, which is how to write a winning SBIR proposal. So even before turning the page, I'm going to say I'm only going to touch on a few aspects of this because this is a very, very deep subject. There's lots of great information online in terms of websites, in terms of presentations. I think there was a great event last week. I didn't get a chance to participate, but at UC Riverside that do deep dives into this. And there's really a lot of training and education that can go into this, but enough to get a sense of, hey, I think I might want to write a phase one proposal. What does that look like? That's what I want to bring across here. So first and foremost, you need to understand the evaluation criteria for that proposal. And there's really four main areas. The first is the technical merit. So this is making sure that you will be evaluated based on how responsive your response is in terms of novelty, in terms of having a sound technical idea, understanding you know, what that need is that you're responding to and making sure that your innovation or solution is on target with it and that you've got a good work plan to execute and that you've taken into account potential pitfalls, you've lined up the necessary resources. So really, you know, do you have a good technical idea? Does it hold water? All right, that's the technical merit. The commercialization potential gets to your ability, the firm's ability to bring this to market. So that's first understanding the market. Is it, you know, what's the size of that market, and how is the small business going to approach selling into that market? Are there competitors? What differentiates the new solution from the existing competitors? And, you know, how are you going to then position yourself now, given that kind of landscape, that there's an opportunity, there's competitors, here's where our innovation fits in. Then what's your plan of attack to get into that market? So that's another aspect of the commercialization score. Every agency in the phase one proposal has a dedicated section to commercialization. So that's where you emphasize these aspects. The team. So having a capable team, and this kind of goes back to the question earlier about the principal investigator, you know, and the credentials around the principal investigator. So that's a key individual that needs to have relevant experience, relevant education, relevant experience. But in addition to that, who rounds out that team? Really making sure that, you know, if you have a ultimate vision of your solution is that you've got some innovation, but to realize that it requires software, it requires electronics, it requires being in a mechanical assembly, then do you have, you know, a software designer? Do you have a electronics engineer? Do you have a mechanical engineer? May or may not be very important for phase one, but as you get deeper into the program, your staff needs to have those capabilities. If they're not in-house, then that's fine. Then represent them, go out, identify a consultant or subcontractor who could augment your team to provide that capability. And also equipment, facilities, you know, do you have access to all the resources kind of as a business to make this program successful in-house or through collaborations or partnerships that you bring in. And then the broader impacts. We talked about this a bit earlier. If it's a broad topic, then you definitely need to emphasize those aspects of how the fully realized innovation is going to help achieve that agency's mission or that department within the agency's mission by, and, you know, usually it's big things, right? Saving money, saving lives, things to that effect. And then if it's a very specific topic, like DoD topics tend to be, then making sure that the solution matches what the proposed innovation matches what's needed and all the requirements in the solicitation. So this is all the agencies interpret these somewhat differently, but in a nutshell, any phase one proposal needs to have coverage in all these areas, or strong emphasis in all these areas, to be responsive and to score well. Any questions here?
There was a question in the chat by Ori. He says, let's see, I'm just jumping to. Okay, Acala is a college admissions and career counseling platform for middle and high school students. We have a finished product and users. What are the most important things in an application for a company like us that is further along than concept?
It's a really great question. I think I would kind of flip it around and say, how can SBIR help you meet your business goals? And that'll be really the third part of this briefing. But in a nutshell, if you have an established product and an established market and you're doing well, then where does SBIR fit in? Maybe you have some new innovation that that again may or may not work out, but if you put in, I don't know, this new AI algorithm that will, substantially improve the ability to match students with, the right counselors, or to outline their plan, or it'll address a highly underserved portion of the market that in order to fulfill your mission of no child being left behind, you need to then incorporate that attribute. And that's now the focus of your SBIR application, is to, so you've got some maturity, whether it's your technology or a business, but you're almost going back down in maturity, technical maturity, to capture some new piece that, if it works out, will catapult your business to the next level. That's one way to frame it. And there might be more than that, but that's an example where an established business can leverage SBIR to deepen its capabilities or expand its product offering by incorporating a new innovation.
I also noticed in your slide that broke down all of the different agencies that the Department of Education typically puts out pretty specific SBIR requests for proposals. So yes. I'm not professional, but perhaps a good way forward is to kind of keep an eye out and see if there is a type of technical innovation that would be a good use case for your product, Ori, and kind of work a little backwards in that way, if it's worth the time and commitment. But I did note that for the Department of Education that they typically put out specific proposals.
Yeah, absolutely. Take a look at the topics, the prior topics, the mission of the organization, what they're doing, and new ideas might come to mind. I'm going to move ahead so we can get to the heart of this. So real quick, I think that the key here is really the top line. A proposal is a marketing document, right? As my original boss and mentor, drilled this into my head when I was a young proposal writer, that, this isn't a research paper that you're submitting to a journal. It's a marketing document. So don't prove that don't feel like you need to prove scientifically that your new innovation works. Make a case for it, but really sell the capabilities, right? So just kind of tracing through a few of the key things on the left, make sure that you communicate that you understand the problem and that your innovation targets that problem. If your innovation is on the side of the problem and it's like a nice to have, then it's not a very well put together proposal, because the innovative part isn't actually addressing the problem at hand. It just happens to be there. Maybe there's a better topic for you to write to where your innovation makes a difference. I would say if there's one takeaway from this whole chart, it's to make sure that you present a compelling vision for the end state of your technology. So your innovation might be something that's very small. It might be like a material science, new chemical process to coat one material in another. But and that's what you're proposing, and that's a lot of the technical work plan. But then show that end vision that is enabling a new fuel cell, and that fuel cell is going to allow a much better use of hydrogen energy, and create that picture so that the reader understands that this is the innovation that's going to unlock a huge capability that really impacts what that agency cares about, and society overall. And then we talked about having a competent team, having required resources, and a good commercial plan. Again, if you don't have those internally, then partner with somebody, whether it's another business, university, independent consultant, standalone test lab, and just make sure you represent that in your proposal so that the reviewer knows you've thought this through, you have all the pieces, and that they fit in your budget, because that's the other piece. If you need some really expensive equipment that costs $100,000, then you can't buy that on the phase one, right? So better to make it clear, oh, I'm gonna use it on an hourly basis for 2 days. At the end of the program, it's going to cost $2,000. So then you get access to that equipment. You can still fulfill your scope of work, and it'll improve your work plan. So remember, tailor your proposal to the topic. Talk to the individuals in the government to the extent permissible. Some are not open or allowed, but if you can, talk to them live on the phone is best of all. Email's okay. The web. The downside of that is that if you have a conversation with the Q&A through the web portal, all your competitors will see the answers too. So weigh that in your questions. And again, be persistent. You may or may not win your first few, but learn from them, go back out, write a stronger proposal. If you're really committing to SBIR as a funding path, then it's going to take, there's a learning curve. It's going to take some time, and stay with it. And then briefly, here is the submission timeline. Really, the takeaway is that it can take a long time. So if at T0 here on the bottom left, the topics are released, then it may take, usually there's a window of time you can submit. It could be 2 months. It could be longer, depending on some of the agencies where there's a letter of intent. But from that time that you really start and submit your proposal, another 4 months is going to go by. So you're at now, T0 plus 6 months before they notify you of award. So then great, we've got a phase one award coming. Congratulations. Well, usually it's about 3 or 4 months of time for them to then process that into an actual grant or contract award, where your period of performance starts and you can start working, start accumulating charges to bill the government, to get reimbursed, to get paid. And so it could be 9 months, right, from the time that you first see that opportunity to propose to when you get funded, right? So that means if we submit a proposal today, okay, you're probably not starting work until something like July of next year, to put that in perspective. So so it's going to take time. So then the phase one is about 6 to 9 months long, or 6 to 12 months long. So that now puts you at 15 to 21 months from when you kind of started this whole process to your phase one ends. And then that's around the time you'll turn in your phase two proposal. Then another 4 or 5 months till that award is notified and started. So now you're out at about 19 to 25 months, so about 2 years out. And then that's usually a 2-year period of performance. So we're talking about, you're getting out to about 3.5, 4 years till the end of a phase two. And through that time, you've been funded maybe $1 million to $2 million total dollars of funding. So, so this will tie to the pros and cons. I'll save it for that slide coming up.
I had a quick question, Juan. I'm Greta. Nice to meet you. I have a friend who I'm pretty sure it's an SBIR grant that I know they've gotten them before for their company that works in mental health. And he was mentioning, and now I'm not exactly sure if this specific grant was SBIR, but he was mentioning that he can't unlock that grant money until he gets a certain amount of investment dollars into his company. Like there was some kind of like, hey, you need to, like, they needed to see like, $1 million come in either in contracts or in VC money in order to unlock this grant. And might not be SBIR, but I was just curious if you ever see those kind of setups, right? And that relationship between like this non-dilutive capital being unlocked.
Yeah, that's So such a thing can happen. That's called like an in-kind funding match, or just generally a funding match. And that can be a requirement for certain types of funding. And it can be a requirement for certain types of SBIR. That is not a vanilla phase 1 or phase 2 SBIR. That is a special program. It could be a specific type of phase 2 SBIR. Or a specific type of grant, but that's generally not a constraint. But it can happen. And sometimes another case where that happens is once you get to phase 2, there are certain types of like phase 2 enhancements or phase 2Bs, or there is some additional opportunity to get a little bit more phase 2 money after a phase 2 base period ends. And then that's usually where there's these matching funding requirements where if you get $500,000 from the outside, then the government will come with $500,000 and you'll get another $1 million.
Got it. Cool. Thank you. That's super helpful. I just wasn't sure how typical that was. But I think they've gotten one before, so it makes sense that it would be a little bit kind of further down the journey.
Yep. And I'll just briefly mention, there are some accelerated programs. Air Force AFWorks is a really good one that can do an award within something like 30 days of submission. It's a smaller award. It's a much faster pace type of program. And it is possible to do a direct to phase 2, where if you've demonstrated feasibility outside of an SBIR phase 1, you can apply directly to a phase 2. That is possible. It is great. Those tend to have a much lower win rate, less than 10 or 15%. So those can be very competitive. So let's turn to the kind of main question here. Now that you kind of understand what and how, why, why pursue SBIR? Well, there's pros and there's cons, right? As we talked about, non-dilutive, no equity impact, no debt. That's great. That's a really great opportunity. Great funding source for kind of like pre-seed, seed, risky R&D. It may or may not pan out. Another investor might not want to foot the bill for that. If you're bootstrapping your company, you may not want to foot the bill for that if it's that risky, right? So it's a great opportunity to tap into that. And then once you have it, it's some validation, right? Especially once you've been through it, that you can take to investors, hey, we worked on this program, we got this government feedback, we did these things. It gives you some credibility, and hopefully you've built the value of your business through that non-dilutive funding, so then you don't suffer as much dilution in subsequent funding rounds. We talked about the SBIR data rights, that you have essentially kind of first right of refusal. You maintain those rights and first right of refusal on patents. Another good pro is that if you're working with the government in an area where regulations, you can work closely with the government and understand those regulations and potentially influence them, right? As new technologies are emerging, there may not be all the rules and laws established from the beginning that you can then help to influence and help create that kind of pave the way for your technology in the future. And we talked about sole source or non-competitive funding for follow-ons. One thing we didn't mention is that once you're on contract, the government's a great customer, very reliable. They pay regularly, good cash flow. CFOs always love it. So in terms of the cons, right, we went through the timeline. It can be slow time to get awarded. There are reporting requirements, not usually too much overhead associated with that, but there is a bureaucratic load. And I don't want to trace through all the details here because there's multiple different ways to handle this. I don't want to scare anybody away, but let's say the more you get involved with doing business with the government, the more you need to build up infrastructure to do business with the government, like having approved rates in terms of direct rates, indirect rates for overhead, general and administrative, fringe. You need to do timekeeping, total time accounting. So employees need to sign a timesheet each day that show how many hours they worked, so that time they spend on the contracts can be accounted for properly and the government gets billed properly. There's export regulations, cybersecurity requirements go up every 3 months. Eventually you need an approved purchasing system. So for phase 1, don't worry about it. There's lightweight ways to take care of all of this, but the deeper you go in the program, the more you have to pay attention to these requirements, and they're important requirements. We talked about topics, and if you pursue topics that are narrow and not aligned with your business mission, it could distract you from your real customers. And I'll talk a little bit more about that on an upcoming slide. In terms of how you staff for this, you need R&D staff. The more programs you do, the more R&D staff you need. Eventually, if SBIR funding goes away, because you hit a dry spell or whatever, then where those SBIR staff go. So you're kind of building up a horizontal business model to support the SBIR R&D. If that's not part of your core business today, think about, is that how you want to be in a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now? And the funding is really like capital, right? You can count it as revenue, but it's not recurring revenue by any stretch, right? As soon as the funding goes away, it's gone. And so think about the real value it's building in your business. And what that kind of boils down to is, in terms of the speed of the program and the kind of bureaucracy, it may affect your business's agility, right? So if you're doing a startup where you're trying to get to market and trying to address your customers' needs, you got to weigh that relative to the pace that your government sponsor, your government customer is going to be moving with respect to that. And if the topic you're working on isn't aligned with what your business is meant to do, it's kind of tangentially related. Think about how much energy you might end up pouring into that doesn't necessarily fulfill your end mission. And, things like timekeeping, writing the number of hours down every single day that you're working, is that the culture of your business as a startup, where maybe people are working crazy hours until they start to see how many hours they're working every day writing it down? That might affect, your business culture. So it's a different type. It kind of drives a different type of behavior in some respect.
I know it wasn't intentional, Juan, it's your accent, but it sounded like you said customers. And honestly, I think I'm going to keep that as the phrase moving forward, because there is an element of cost to where you are, in terms of stakeholder management and customers, like, it is costing you when you're not paying attention to them. That's really funny.
Yeah.
It's
yeah,
a great,
that's
the distraction element of the time commitment. Although, like, also kind of on the flip side, thinking about your business in these ways, although it might be early for a team, actually is building the operational foundations that are going to solve a lot of issues down the line when they're, in terms of like employees and bookkeeping and, all of that stuff that ends up, you can't avoid, if your business is going to be successful, at some point you're going to have to do this work. And so it is good to get it out of the way, although it is a heavy lift early on.
It's a really good point. I think, businesses that have had a lot of experience working with the federal government or going through a government audit, then your books are clean. You're in a good position then later for investors. You've gone through that legwork. Just at what phase do you want to go through it? All right, we'll forge ahead. I think there's 2 other slides I'd like to go through. So kind of distilling from that, right? What are 3 strong themes that, if you fulfill one or more of these, create a better affinity towards SBIR? The first is, if you're developing something that's naturally going to take years to develop, right? If you need years of R&D, then that's great. The speed doesn't necessarily affect you. And a lot of that speed is on the front end. Once you've gotten 1 or 2 of these, you can then write proposals and execute programs at the same time. So the time from one program ending to another starting could be seamless. So this is great, in deep tech, and it's evidenced by those agencies that have the most funding to pour into these types of technologies, right? It goes hand in hand. The agencies that take years to develop a product for are the ones who tend to fund R&D. So that's kind of another litmus test of when you're a good fit. The other is, if you're working in a highly regulated industry, then again, working with the government sponsor can really be helpful. You can get firsthand guidance from people who work at the NIH that can help support your FDA application in the future. If you're doing aerospace, then you can work with FAA or military aviation experts that give you much better understanding of how that product, what requirements it needs to meet, and can help you. And space would be another example. And then the last theme is if you want to sell to the government, right? If you are a B2G business or you want that to be a key market segment, then hey, this is a great introduction to doing business with the government. You can start to meet people, you can network with your sponsor within the government, and ultimately put yourself in a better position to sell to the government, potentially under an SBIR phase 3. So those are 3 strong indicators that can make SBIR more viable and better aligned with your long-term business strategy. Forge ahead to the next slide, and then I'll take questions there. So the other key piece that I think any business can ask themselves, right, is in terms of alignment with the business strategy. At the end of the day, right, funding, capital, it is just the fuel in the tank, right? The fuel in the tank that helps your business reach your business goals, wherever that funding is coming from. And with funding, there is only one certainty. You will spend it. You will spend it. So regardless, then, you need to ask yourself, once that money is gone, how far or how much farther down the road am I to meeting my business goals, right? And if the answer is through the execution of this program and using this funds to get to that purpose, have I, built my business infrastructure, completed a core innovation, tested product market fit? If it's helping you towards that end, or to the larger extent that every dollar is fueling you down that road, then that's a great road to be on. And if it's taking you on a tangent to explore some other avenues that, hey, well, there was money there, let's check it out, let's see, had somebody, had an extra engineer wanted to sponsor him for another year anyway, or her, then, maybe it's not the best road, or maybe that road connects back to the highway some way downstream. You may not know everything, at this point. Of course, we don't know can't predict the future, but I think you can make an educated guess as to how well aligned it is with your business strategy. And another way to frame this, I think, is to say, how well can SBIR build your competitive advantage? To the larger extent that it can build your competitive advantage in a way that's durable and is going to still be there when the SBIR funding is gone for whatever reason, because you lost a few in a row, or because you graduated from the program and you're 500 people or whatever. Is what stays behind when you can no longer use that, and hopefully there's a recurring revenue aspect there that builds your valuation. But even if not, if there's something that's really enhanced your business capabilities, then this would be another strong motivator to pursue the program. So maybe with that, I'll conclude and take any other questions. Really, the SBIR program is vast. For every opportunity it creates, there's also that many more regulations. So that's something to pay attention to. And as I said, your business is a great candidate if it can help you with R&D, working with the government, or you want to sell to the government, but proceed with caution, because it takes time, might affect your agility, and don't let it distract you from what any entrepreneur needs to be doing, which is improving your competitive advantage, every day. So with that, if there's any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Looks like Dave is with us. Dave, did you have anything to say?
Just want to thank you, Juan. That was just an outstanding presentation. I've been doing a little bit of drinking from the fire hose on SBIR this year, and that is, I think, the best brief and thorough summary that I've seen. So very much appreciated.
Thank you, Dave.
We need to actually get this up. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion internally at USC on this presentation, and also recommended it to our friends at the Techstars Catalyst program. So hopefully we can get it up on the on our channel ASAP, so a lot of people can access it.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just to further that note, I do think that the question lives all day, every day at the Startup Garage, which I'm sure it's in the minds and hearts of early stage teams, which is, shouldn't I, SBIR? And so I think that without, exaggeration, this presentation gives a pretty good understanding of whether you should or you shouldn't. At the end of the day, I really do think it has to do with like ability, bandwidth, the available SBIRs. I mean, a lot of it still is a heavy lift for founders to kind of do their own research and to figure it out. It's not a one size fits all program.
Yeah.
However, you like this last slide, I think it really brings it home, which is that if it's not going to take you from point A to point B, and point B is your business is in a better position than it was, then you're probably just you have like scarcity mindset and you're just chasing the dollar bills, which is a dangerous place to be in the early stage of business development.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, so thank you for your time. Everyone who's on this and whoever watches this in posterity, you know, Juan is obviously available to, you know, connect with you within reason. I'm not sure, Juan, how you'd like to move forward with that. I think his LinkedIn is shared in all of our distributions, as well as it will be in the library. So a good way, I think, just moving forward would be to connect with him on LinkedIn and send him messages.
Yes.
I mean, I think like this is a valuable resource. People have questions about it. So thank you so much for putting this together.
Yeah, my pleasure. You know, thanks everybody for your attention and the great questions. And yeah, by all means, reach out over LinkedIn. You know, I'll try and be responsive. And, you know, for anything I don't have the resources for, there's a lot of resources out there. I could at least point you in the right direction.
Thank you. Okay, everyone. Our next Oceanside chat, I want to say, is next week, but I'm not 100% sure. You will all receive invitation to that, and hopefully we'll see you then. And Juan, you know, maybe down the line we can get another Oceanside chat out of you with something a little bit more deeper dive. We can talk about that.
Yeah, love to do it. Yeah, we'll find a good topic.
Enjoy your afternoons, everybody. Happy Wednesday.